For this last Christmas, my wife wanted to give out a few decorative blanket ladders for gifts. Each person receiving one had their own style, so I tailored the individual ladders to their preferences. I jumped from one ladder to the next throughout the video, but the process was essentially the same for all three. Once completed, these ladders all stood right at 58 inches tall by roughly 18 inches wide. The main differences are the shape of the rungs and the wood selection. So let's see how they were made. I started on this decorative ladder build with 3 different woods out of my scrap pile. For the different species, I used white oak, sapele, and poplar. The first step was to break down the large boards. I just made a few quick crosscuts with my old jigsaw. Accuracy isn't all that important yet, so I just made the cuts using a speed square and the approximate location. Instead of jointing the boards first, I ripped them on the table saw using a piece of shelving as a straight edge. This method produced a straight cut since the length of the board is held by the shelf. Once that straight edge was established, I moved the whole setup over and ripped the board again to my rough width. Since the boards were already pretty straight, the joining process was much faster than normal. Just a few passes to make sure everything is on plane with one 90-degree corner. Back at the table saw, I ripped the boards again, this time to the final width. My milling sequence is usually a little bit different, but this process worked out just fine. In the end, every board turned out square on all 4 sides, just as intended. I set my miter saw to 15 degrees, ganged the boards together, and cut the ends at the same time. This next step was a little unorthodox, but I wasn't able to fit these boards onto my tapering jig at the table saw. So I just lined them up with a square and made the taper cut right on the miter saw. Just be careful if you decide to use your miter saw like this. To prepare any parts for turning, I shaved off the corners before hitting the lathe. In this case, I set my bandsaw table to about 45 degrees. It's close, but not perfect. These rung parts were all getting turned, so the accuracy of these corner cuts really didn't matter all that much. Essentially, this quick shave was just done to save some time with the roughing gouge. Once I finally cut the rungs onto the lathe, I turned down the tenons on each end. Now this step was really the only part of making the rungs that had to be accurate. The tenon had to fit the mortise that I was going to make later on, but this is also where the width of the rungs could be established by cutting the tenon back to its final shoulder. The shaping of the rungs was the step where the character of each ladder really started to emerge. One set of rungs was made fairly plain, while the other 2 sets received a lot more shaping. Regardless of the shape though, the process was the same. Draw the lines at the widths of the features, cut the depth down to those lines with the parting tool, and then smooth out the areas in between with gouge. With the rungs out of the way, I went back to the rails and marked off the mortise locations with a square. Using a separate square so I could keep the settings, I marked the centers of each rail. When I drilled out the mortises, I made sure to use the same reference face against the fence to ensure that every hole was the same distance from the edges. I only drilled about halfway through before flipping the board over. By drilling in from both sides like this, the edges of the hole were clean with no spilching. And afterwards, I went ahead and hit the rails with a smoothing plane. Only a few passes were needed for nice slick sides. I used a bevel bit to break the edges of the rails. Now there's quite a few different ways to break the edges of a board. Usually I'll just hit the edges with a couple of passes with a block plane. I've really been enjoying this little Bosch router though, so I've been trying to work it in wherever I can. To prepare the rungs for assembly, I had to cut a slot in the tenons so they could be wedged. I approached the bandsaw from behind so that I could watch the cut a little bit more closely. Now on the other sets of rungs, I kept the shaped portion square until after I made these cuts. Even still, these all turned out pretty close to square and even though. I made a little jig to add to my bandsaw sled for cutting small wedges. Basically the MDF addition just held the piece at a slight angle while I made the cut. After I set up for final assembly, I glued the rung tenons around on all sides. With a relatively loose fit, assembly was pretty easy. The wedge side of the tenon and the rung shoulder would be doing all the work anyway. A little more glue in the tenon slot outside the rail, and finally I drove the wedges in. In this case, it was sapele wedges in the white oak ladder. After the glue was dry, I cut off the remainder of the tenon with a flush cut saw. Don't mind that severely mangled wedge there. I turned to my smoothing plane again to finish off the tenon cleanup. A really sharp plane iron and some light passes got it done. I like to mark everything that I make, but I wasn't really sure where to mark a ladder. I ended up just marking the top of a rail with one of my ink stamps. My go-to finish for these ladders was General Finish's Armor Seal. Leading up to that though, the finish process for each ladder was pretty different, and covering all of that would take way too long. Just know that there was some shellac, 2 different gel stains, and then Armor Seal on top. Now I did spray the shellac on, but the Armor Seal I wiped on by hand. It's always one of the best parts of any project to watch the wood come alive as the finish is applied. And after 2 to 3 coats of Armor Seal on top, the finishing was done. I had taped off the feet of the ladder so that they wouldn't receive any finish, and that bare wood was just what I wanted. You see, I wanted to add some type of foot padding to the bottom of the rails, and epoxy is just going to adhere better to bare wood. Setting the leather pads in the epoxy was interesting. I wasn't sure how to clamp the leather down, so I just used the weight of the ladder to bear down on it. Once that epoxy was cured, I went back and trimmed the edges with a very sharp paring chisel. I matched the bevel of the leather to the small bevel on the foot of the wood rail. I prepped the edges of the leather by using a Q-tip to wet the edges with some water. By using a wood handle and rubbing it back and forth, I lightly burnished the edges of the leather. Ironically, that wood handle I used was attached to my burnisher. I'm sure there's a pun in there somewhere. Then I brought the ladders inside and my wife loaded them up to see how they worked out. One ladder was being hand-delivered almost immediately, while another was being picked up. The third ladder had to sit there for a while, but we eventually got it out the door.
So there you have it, folks. 3 different ladders for 3 different people. They all came out quite different from one another, but I know all the recipients really enjoyed their gifts. I'm also glad I was able to show you all the process of the ladders being made. These ladders were a really fun Christmas build, and so yeah, that's another project all wrapped up, and hope you enjoyed the show.